Hello, and welcome to the Masterclass, Identities and the Job Search webinar, which is a collaboration between the NASPA Region 4 East New Professional and Graduate Students Knowledge Community and the Gender and Sexuality Knowledge Community. The webinar will discuss and focus ways in which you can navigate your multiple identities through an entry-level job search process. My name is Amanda Dickinson-Byrne. I'm going to be your host for the webinar. I'm also the Professional Development Chair for the Region 4 East Gender and Sexuality Knowledge Community. A few reminders for folks before we get started. Folks can post on the Facebook page if you search Masterclass Identities and Job Search. So we'll be monitoring that throughout the webinar. Questions, feedback, anything you want to share, live quotes, please feel free to do so. And then we're going to have a live Q&A after about 40 to 45 minutes of content. So just you can use the chat function on the YouTube Live and just type in questions, and then we will give those to Alex. So let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today's Masterclass webinar. Alex C. Lang describes himself as a South Florida native navigating a Midwest world. They currently work at Michigan State as both the Assistant Director of the Lesbian, Bisexual, Gay and Transgender Resource Center, as well as the coordinator of organizational effectiveness for the Division of Student Affairs and Services. Please feel free throughout the webinar to use the hashtag #SAMasterclass. And with that introduction, it is my pleasure to turn it over to Alex.
Great, thanks so much, Amanda. I am really honored and excited to be here on behalf of the KCs. To really talk about today how we talk about identity in the job search process. I will give a few disclaimers first. One, as I tell all the people who go through any of the things that I do about training or teaching, is I think I am hilarious. Most people just find me funny. And in this kind of environment, I can't hear when you're laughing, so I'm just going to assume it's happening. But also to say that I hope this presentation illuminates some parts of what may come up in the job search, but it's not truly exhaustive. And I want opportunities to connect and for us to build knowledge, especially in the question and answer portion later today. So again, as we go through today, feel free to use the hashtag #SAMasterclass to maybe tweet on the back channel on Twitter or on Facebook, so we can see how we can keep this conversation going after today, or even after this hour. So I think it's very important to share what I intend, hoping happens today. And if you talk to anyone who talks about intent and impact, right, there's learning that I will intend, and there may be impacts that I didn't intend, which may be good, may be bad. So as a result of participating in this webinar, participants should be able to, one, identify aspects of the job search process where their multiple identities will come into play. Two, deconstruct ideas of fit, understanding it as multidimensional. And I'm going to really unpack fit for a little bit because I think we use it as a really coded word in student affairs, as we do in other job fields as well. And then three is, my hope is after today, you really can start thinking about identifying 2 to 3 guideposts or anchors that will help guide your search process. Whether it's this year, next year, that you've already gone through it, and you're trying to think of a new one as well. So just to give us a roadmap of where we're going to go today, I'm going to start by situating us with a critical lens on the job search process. Really, it's the way that I view my work as a practitioner and a scholar in this field. I'll also talk briefly about the socio-historical context of the United States currently, right? We'll get to that in a second. We'll also talk about the anchors and guideposts I talked about in the learning outcomes, talk about different aspects of the job search, specifically location, institutional type, as well as mission and values, and functional areas. And then we'll talk about negotiating support and navigating systems of oppression, which, you know, I have an hour, and yet there's so much that could be unpacked in that as well. And then I've really tried to leave a fair amount of time for Q&A, and so this is meant to be interactive as possible. So please feel free to ask questions as we go through. So first, I want to start a quote from Elisa Avis in her recent New Directions for Student Services about critical theories in student development theory. She shares this, Critical and post-structural theories deconstruct, critique, and put at the forefront systems of inequality. Hence, this approach to theory avoids problematizing the student's development and focuses on how the environment plays a role in how students develop. And so today I'm really trying to situate how we talk about this process, not as it is the responsibility of just you as a job seeker to have to navigate and you are the problem if you don't get a job, or you are the problem if you aren't able to get an interview right. There's often systems at work that are challenging us and challenging marginalized and minoritized people to think in more brilliant and creative ways to get jobs, right? And so I really want to talk about how we talk about the systems of the job search that may come into play and rub against you, as well as others in this process. So again, really want to take much more of a critical lens on how we do this work. So I want to start off talking about that critical lens with this word fit. I imagine as many of you who are currently watching maybe job searching upcoming, the talk has been about, well, you need to find the right fit. You need to find the right institution to work at, right? And we use this language of fit often in ways that are very coded, right? So I have some visual examples and I'll talk through them really quickly, right? So on the left of your screen, you'll see a square, rectangular, peg, and a round hole. This is often the discussion of fit is, well, if you don't fit, you shouldn't go there, right? The fit is, I have the square peg, and often in that bottom right image you see, we need to either really conform ourselves to fitting in the round hole, or we just don't fit, right? And that's our way of, as an institution, to say, well, that person didn't fit here, right? And what does that mean? How do we unpack that coded language as people who are hiring people to come into our institutions? And I would challenge us to stop using the word fit and start saying what we actually mean. So taking sentences and actually literally replacing the word fit with something else. So is the person not align with our values? And what are our values and how do they not align? Do we feel this person isn't going to fit into our office's culture? Well, what is our office's culture and why wouldn't they fit, right? So really flipping the question of fit in this manner to really think much more critically about it as we go through it. And really, I think fit as a multi-dimensional piece. So if we look at the top right image, right there, we have this sort of reflection of how sort of a round peg fits into a square and round hole, but we just need to think differently and more creatively about how we do fit. And are we creating more expansive opportunities for people to fit, or are we just saying only the people that currently fit are allowed to fit here, right? I think I've said the word fit more times this year in this moment than I have this all year just now. But I really want us to think about how we use fit as professionals to think about, do I want to fit somewhere, right? So some people may even say that I, Alex Lang, fit here at Michigan State University, which is my current place of employment. And one of the things I think about is, do I want to fit here? You know, not necessarily fit in here, because Lord knows I disrupt all the time. But how is my process of fitting in or resisting fitting in or like sort of jamming myself into this hole to create more expansive possibilities, the ways to think about how I'm coming into a job. I also, if you talk to any of the graduate students here at Michigan State University or just talk to me personally, know that I am history is so important. History in many ways protects our hopefulness. History is what informs all of our current work. And if we are ahistorical, we just think that we are better than who has come before us, and that is in no ways true. Oftentimes, no one is really new to history. We are just more so new to history. But history is very familiar with thoughts and patterns in ways that we are not as individuals. So to provide some context as to what's going to happen and what's happening and what is going to happen, right? We are only 3 weeks into a new federal administration, including a new Secretary of Education, which has been in many ways full of certainty and uncertainty over what will or will not happen in regards to higher education as well as our country. So if we think about the recent appointment of Betsy DeVos, she is from Michigan. So some of us who are in Michigan have a little bit more greater familiarity with her. And the ways in which she may or may not be influential in higher education has been a cause of concern, right? In addition, we are seeing waves, I think, of activism on and off campuses that has really been happening for years and decades, but it's just actually just getting more mainstream attention for once. And so I think there is a really important role that student affairs professionals in several functional areas play a role in helping student activists navigate higher education and the systems of higher education, more so than maybe we have been trained on or thought of before. And we have to put in context, there's an increasing cost of post-secondary institutions. So we are seeing students gain less and less access in some ways, but we are also seeing budgets being slashed, not just at our institutions, but for the state institutions that are less and less funding their public institutions, right? There's a great point that more so rather than being a state institution, it's more of a state located institution because of the lack of funding institutions are receiving from their states. So it's more so that oftentimes schools like the University of Michigan, Michigan State, we just happen to be located in Michigan, but I don't know how well we are funded by the state to continue our operations in many ways. And I think running through all of this is both fear, uncertainty, and pushback that we're seeing in this time that is really going to affect potentially questions in the job search, how we think about who we want to hire and bring aboard teams in this process. So I want to situate us in that context before we move forward, right? So to review thus far, I've said, right, we're in this critical paradigm and we are in this socio-historical paradigm to go through the rest of this presentation. So many of us have often seen this graphic, probably on our social media potentially. Some may not, and that's all right too. But this often relates to our students and how students in undergraduate in particular say you have to choose two, you can't get all three in your undergraduate experience. So you either get enough sleep, a social life, good grades. If you get good grades in a social life, you're not getting enough sleep, for instance, or if you're getting enough sleep and good grades, you're not having a social life, for instance. This is often a sort of a meme that goes around Facebook in particular with students and some staff as well. But I want us to think about today, what will guide you through your job search process? It is oftentimes that location, functional area, salary, quality of life, and connection to community. We would desire them all wherever we go in our job search processes. And some people do have all of these at this point in their career, which is great. And there's a reality that that is not possible everywhere we go. Another interesting piece, though, is how the Fair Labor Act and how it's currently still being tossed around, and who knows what the new administration is going to do with it. How salary will be effective in this conversation. There are some really great institutions that prior to the act being put on hold by a Texas judge have honored that the salary increases are still going to happen for their employees, which is great. Others have said, well, we're going to wait. And that's an interesting choice. So I think as you're thinking about your job search process, it's really important to think for you, what are going to be your deepest, heaviest anchors in this process, right? Because when I was searching, I graduated from the University of Georgia in 2014, and one of the pieces that was really important to me in my process was the functional area, particularly doing inclusion and equity work, as well as connection to community. So having access to an outside campus community of folks that would help sustain me as I come into work and do quote unquote the work. So these are some of the pieces that may guide you in your process, but really being intentional about how you're thinking about them as well. So I really emphasize this idea of anchors because for a few reasons. One is there are a ton of jobs open in student affairs every single year. I still get my higher ed jobs agent emails and see what I just like to see what's happening in the field, who's hiring, who's not, what's newly being hired, what's being opened several times. And as a way of both thinking about, because there's so many jobs, how do you pick which ones you apply to, right? For those of us who are new professionals or have gone through a few different job searches, I will personally say that I was telling this to a graduate student yesterday, I wish I could burn every cover letter I ever wrote because they were so painful. And it's just never a pleasant process. So part of the self-care in this process too is thinking about how many jobs do you want to apply to? In some folks do apply for 30, 40, 50 jobs within a month's period. And that's due to various different circumstances, right? Folks need income, right? That's really real, that people need to sustain themselves, that after grad school, if you hopefully have an assistantship, that funding runs out in May. And so you're trying to figure out and get a job quickly, right? But for others who may have different ways of being able to take time or still be forced to try and be in this period, how are you grounding yourself that when you get there, you don't hate where you get, to the best of your abilities to control that? And how are you going to make decisions when offers begin to come through? So if you're applying to multiple jobs at once and maybe you have a few competing offers on the table, how are you making that decision before you get to the decision-making process? How will you think about, so for me, for instance, I had this job offer the same time I did another one at another institution, and that one was focused in leadership development, for instance. And for me, it came down to proximity to an airport and location, as well as I liked to staff members at both institutions. I loved the work I would get to do at both institutions. But for me, it was very key to be within an hour, hour and a half proximity to an airport, and the other institution wasn't, right? And that was it made that decision much more easier and more of a snap piece than it was before. So I think that's really important to think about, like, what will ground you in this process, because if you don't have grounding as you move forward, you can just wind up all over the place and really be left with some really tough decisions as you move forward. So I want to offer some different considerations, particularly around some different aspects of the job search and maybe thinking about them a little bit differently. So first, what's the cost of living? And I want to talk about the cost of living, both financial and psychological. There are a lot of institutions in this country, and they're in a lot of different places, right? So one, really thinking about what is the cost of living and how does that relate to the potential salary of a job. I personally believe that all jobs should just post the salary ranges and requirements rather than leaving them blank. I think it's really frustrating and irritating, especially as you're trying to consider living there, and the one point you're finally offered something is towards the end of the process, which makes it really hard to start making some decisions and making some of that grounding. And so thinking about what does transparency look like in the process of cost of living, but also what's the psychological cost of living where you're going to live, and in multiple dimensions. So as Amanda shared at the beginning, I am originally from South Florida. I was in Georgia before I was here in Michigan, and the weather was one of really big changes for me. Right now, for those of you in the Northeast, I hope you're staying warm with that blizzard that's out there right now. But for me, it was getting used to being in really cloudy skies for a good portion of the year, and being in the sort of overcast piece. Now, the misnomer about Florida, for instance, is that we are called the Sunshine State, but I think we are ranked 22 out of 50 for most sunlight given to any given state at any time. But that's because it rains, but then it leaves really quickly. And you get just gross humidity with sunshine, though. And so how is your context changing going to affect you is a really important thought. Also, how is it going to feel if, so for instance, you live in a pretty heterogeneous environment based on race and gender currently, and go to a pretty homogeneous one, and really go to one that's pretty white, right? That changes some things, right? And it's really important to think in these multiple ways of how where you live, how specifically that proximity is going to affect you. And to think of the possibilities of how you learn that information, right? So it's great that if people on campus are quote unquote honest with you about what's going on in the locale that you'd be living in, but how can you use some other overlapping sources to inform your thinking, right? So when I was looking here at Michigan State, one of the things I did was looked at the Lansing State Journal and saw what it was saying about both campus and the community. Often I think our job searches are so much about the campus and not about the community we'd be potentially living in. And for me, that was a really important aspect to think about, but I think I even thought about it a little bit too late, to be honest. Look at your campus news sources, right? We have plenty of student media out there that is creating some interesting pieces about how do we think through what's happening with the campus and town-gown relations. And how are students thinking about that, which is really important. Also, I would encourage folks to use the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate map. As many folks may probably already know, we are in a rise of hate incidents as compared to this time last year. And so the Southern Poverty Law Center, to the best of its abilities, actually tracks organizations and incidents like that through a tool on their website. So what's happening in this area that you're applying for, right? What's going on? Is it something that's ongoing, like an organization that is present there? How much power does that organization have in its presence there? And thinking through that. In 2015, also the Human Rights Campaign, which is generally a predominantly LG, sometimes B, almost never T organization, put out their Municipal Equality Index and actually looks at different locales, more so major cities, but looks about their city ordinances, state ordinances, and actually gives a score based on how well for LGBT equality that particular municipality is for. And so again, how are you using these overlapping frameworks to really inform your thinking about what the costs of living there are, and potential exciting things as well, but potential barriers as well to your experience. So another thing I'll talk about is considerations of the institution, its mission, and its values. I think we often talk about this in a very sort of perfunctory way when we're talking about our job search processes. So we talk about it as like, ooh, what institutional type do you want to work at, right? And we talk about, ooh, this has got this nice little buzzword of, because everybody wants global leaders these days. That's the whole thing, which is really interesting in a Make America First society, right? Again, thinking about how our socio-historical context informs our institutions, right? So really, what does the institution espouse as its mission and values, and how does it define those values? So, for instance, here at Michigan State University, our values are quality, inclusiveness, and connectedness, for instance. And how does the institution define those, right? Do students readily know what those things mean? Do faculty and staff know what those things mean? We, for instance, have a whole page on our president's website that is dedicated to defining those. And yet, I think the challenge is something that Sarah Ahmed draws our attention to. For those who don't know who Sarah Ahmed is, she is a brilliant, prolific feminist writer. And one of the things she talks about is performatives and non-performatives, particularly as speech acts. And in her work on anti-racism, Sarah Ahmed talks about how non-performative speech acts work by not bringing the effects that they name. And so an example of a non-performative is often when campus presidents who are trying to respond to instances of institutional racism on their campuses say, well, this is an inclusive place. Really? Interesting, because the folks who just experienced the racism actually don't think that. And actually their experiences of racism are proving this is not an inclusive place. It's not an equitable or just place, right? So are the mission and values of the institution actually aligned with where the institution puts its pocketbook, where the institution puts its time and energy behind, right? In particular, when we talk about student success, retention, persistence, graduation, all of these words, how are we in closing the gap and addressing what many would call the opportunity gap rather than the achievement gap? How are we as institutions putting our money where our mouth is on some of these things? So if presidents are saying, or vice presidents of student affairs are saying, well, this is an inclusive place, where is their time and wallet when it comes to backing up that statement, right? And what does that tell you about the institution? There are some incredible institutions that are putting their wallets and their time behind addressing these issues, and there are institutions that are not. And if you are fine with either of those situations, that's a different conversation. But if it's about working in an office and then saying, well, this isn't what we value here, but in some ways it is what we value, we just don't say we value it, how will you deal with that dissonance in a potential office or an environment? And that's a question really only you can answer. I know that for me personally, there are times that I am incredibly frustrated by that. But I also am sometimes subversive in how I use the language of inclusiveness back at our institution and saying, well, this is what we say is the value. This is what we pay all that money to put on a big old billboard in our admissions videos. So are we just setting up a fallacy, or are we actually going to do this work, right? And then again, thinking about how many non-performatives are you able to handle as an individual, right? I have seen in the last 3 or 4 years in particular, both friends at other institutions and at my current institution, where we espouse a lot of things and there is some movement on some things, and other things there's no movement. And so how are we thinking through and talking about our ability to handle those non-performatives? And it may be about what those non-performatives are about, if they're about anti-racism, if they're about sort of addressing sexism on campus. How are we thinking through those pieces? I think also too, there's a place of commiseration in both the job search and once you're on a campus, and thinking through how I'll give an example. So there's a group of us here who are on a team who are analyzing qualitative data around climate here and other campuses as well. And one of the things that we noticed in these transcripts was the role of laughter among minoritized people. And one of the things we've been thinking about too is how laughter has been a source of community building and figuring out how people understand the campus climate, because they laugh because they are like, we know that's not true, and so we're just going to laugh because we know it's not true. And thinking through how we build community, or even look for side-eye as cues of when we're on campuses of what is and what is not happening. It's really interesting because I really enjoy my time with students when I'm on campuses interviewing. And one of the things that's really fascinating to me is when I'll throw out a question that may be politically artful, like, yeah, so tell me about like what your daily experience is like here. And there is a moment where there's pause, right? And students will look at each other and be like, well, who wants to go, right? Or they'll be like giving side-eye because they're like, well, we don't really want to talk about this, right? And thinking about how we sort of use the tools of like discourse analysis to really think about how are we analyzing our campuses and these campuses that we're visiting when we go there to really understand what's going on and what's not going on. So really thinking through those pieces, I think, is important. Another consideration is for your work area or functional area. I think that there is ways to think through and ask questions about how are you going to be supported in your work when instances of white supremacy, cis sexism, misogyny, compulsory able-bodiedness all occur locally and globally. So I'll give another example about this. So as someone from South Florida, as someone with both my sister and my best friend who live in Orlando. My sister attends the University of Central Florida. and what happened this past summer at Pulse nightclub, right? Waking up to that news, knowing that it is a nightclub that I have both been in myself and that my friends go to, was a really triggering, scary morning. I mean, I remember just being on my computer for about 4 hours with my phone next to me trying to get in touch with people. And that happened on a Sunday, late Saturday night into Sunday morning, and many of us woke up to it Sunday morning. And one of the things that was really important for me to think about was I had 2 days off, Monday and Tuesday. It was in summer, so not many students were around as they are in the fall and spring semester terms. But I had to make a decision about, am I going to keep taking those days off? Am I coming into work? And it was really important to have a phone call with my boss pretty immediately after I woke up and talk to her about a few things. One, what was our response going to be? How are we supporting the local response at the Capitol as well as our campus response? Which we did, right? That happened. But it was also really important and critical for my boss to say to me, Alex, I still want you to take those 2 days off. And me feeling both a compulsion to be here, but also a need for a break and a need for time for myself. And it was really important that I had a supervisor who was willing to process that with me and also give me the time off, right? And I think also for my colleagues of color, right, as instances of police violence and the interconnected system of police violence continues to happen, what are the ways in which we are reaching out or telling folks that we work with, hey, you know, maybe take the day off if you need it. We are here for you if you need it, right? And how are we asking those conversations in our search processes, right? How are we asking about what happened, like when these incidences happen, how our campuses are affected and what our response has been? Often it is about caring for our students, but how are we caring for each other as professionals and truly creating systems of care that work for ourselves as well as our students? I think we can focus on both through a both and rather than thinking only one or the other is possible in these instances. And the other piece to think about too is in what ways is your work and non-work tied to your dominant and minoritized identities, right? So I think there is a conceived notion that you know, minoritized folks help minoritized folks, and we sort of we are put into multicultural centers, LGBT resource centers, disability resource centers to sort of help one another, which is great. And what are the ways in which my colleagues in leadership development and service learning are talking about whiteness, right? Because if you think that your race does not apply to any of the job that you're coming in, you're fooling yourself. We have to think about how our dominance shows up in these spaces and how it gives us excuses to say, well, I don't have to talk about heterosexism. That's Alex's job up there in the LGBT Resource Center, right? How are we having conversations in our conduct meetings about how potentially the ways in which people and our students breaks our code of conduct are because of their dominant or subordinated identities, right? How are we thinking about the ways in which we are coming to work to have those conversations? And so when we're thinking about which functional areas to apply to, I would want us and you to critically interrogate how applying to certain functional areas and figuring out the why of that. Is it because you just love that piece? Do you love that piece because you don't have to explicitly talk about anti-racism all the time? Do you love that part of the job because you can talk about anti-racism all the time, right? There are some incredible housing departments that are, doing some really good work around thinking about how we talk to RAs and our hall staffs about addressing inclusion and equity in our work. And so again, how are we asking these questions in ways that allows us to think about why we are and are not applying for certain jobs and institutions, and who is not responsible for the work? Because I will tell you from my personal experience, and while it may be limited, more and more those of us who are in identities, doing identity-based work, are very much deans of students for our identity, the groups that we work with, right? I don't just do programs with students. I help them navigate housing and policy and having conversations with our Vice President of Student Affairs in different ways that require different sets of leadership and expansive possibilities than maybe working in a particular office around particular ideas is. So just to think that through in our job search processes is really important. So I'll talk about negotiating support a bit and thinking through some pieces of how you identify and talk about support, whether through phone interviews or in on-campus processes or whatnot. So one is, what support do you need to do your job effectively and be away from it effectively? A good question I really like to ask folks while I'm on campus is what does success look like in this position? You know, what is the first 6 months? What is someone to need to do to feel like you hired the right person in the first 6 months to do? Which really puts the onus on the person, right? And so one of the things I've been trying to start to wrestle with in conversations as I talk to folks who are doing interviews elsewhere is how is someone supported also from being away from their work, right? And that's a really loaded question to ask. It feels very loaded to ask for many people because many people are like, I'm trying to get a job. I don't want to ask about time off. I don't want to ask about professional development, right? And that is a reality. So I'm going to acknowledge that and say in what spaces do you ask that question may make a difference, right? And how you ask that question may make a difference. So the example earlier before about my personal reaction to Pulse and the shooting at Pulse nightclub, it was really important when I was applying to this job in my one-on-one conversation with the person who would be my supervisor and who is also the chair of the search committee. I asked her, I said, you know, what happens when things get tough for us as individuals here? What happens when things get tough on campus? What does support look like in this office through tough times, right? And asking that question consistently, whether you're working in an identity-based office or not, I think, again, many people think that these conversations are only limited to our centers that support marginalized students, and they're not, quite frankly. Also thinking about, as you're, think critically about your interview agenda for the day. When are you getting to talk to people do you get to talk to students at all? Do you get to talk to students alone? Do you get to talk to other people who would be on your same level? Do you not? Can you ask for that as a part of the process if there is time, right? The worst someone will ever tell you in a search process is no, right? No, you don't get this job. No, we can't raise your salary. No, we can't do this, this, this. But they only can say no when you first ask the question, because otherwise it's an automatic no. And so thinking about the ways in which you as a graduate student and or new professional have the abilities to think about your areas of power, particularly the power to convene once you're on a campus and trying to figure out who your people are going to be when you're on a campus. If the people are only the people in your office, you've got to branch out. You've got to find some other folks. It's been really important for me here at State to actually convene a group of people together that I know from different aspects of campus life. And I did this in this year, actually, brought together faculty, practitioners, and really around Paulo Freire's concept of a praxis group, and people that I could reflect with and also commit to greater action with has been really important. So how do we, in your job search process, who's on the committee? Why are they on the committee? Are they there because you sort of like just do collaborations with that particular office all the time? Are there ways to figure out the motives and the ways in which folks who come to your presentations or campus visits, how do you think about building your network of people from those folks who first attend you and clearly have an interest in you? And in terms of also sort of getting support, always, always, always negotiate your salary, always negotiate your needs, because even if there's like a fixed term salary that they're like, do we have to hire you at this? Again, the worst you can say is, well, I would like to potentially counter, like, can we also raise it $1,000? Can that look like professional development each year instead of into my salary, right? Coming from different lines, because you need to live. You need to be able to, we need to stop exploiting a lot of labor in student affairs and higher education. And it's important for you to advocate for yourself and how you're going to manage being in a system or a place that may be a little tough. Right? And so lastly, the last piece I'll talk about is identity dynamics, again, potentially in the job search process and once you're in the job. So one, does your potential supervisor share your identities? And if not, what conversations are they bringing up about systems of oppression first? Oftentimes, I think, again, we put the onus on the job seeker and not the job employer to talk about these things. And I think more job employers need to be talking about how the ways in which their identities may affect their supervision, right? I think there's some really great work coming from some folks right now that I know of who are working on these for their dissertations, but looking at cross-racial supervision, really trying to think about how we critically think about our supervision practices in the field and how enactments of white supremacy, heterosexism, and systems of oppression are showing up in our supervision structures. I know, so for instance, here at Michigan State University, something that we are trying to be mindful of as an office is the way we have a new performance excellence plan through our HR division. And so reviews have been much more standardized over the past few years. And it's been really important for us to think about how these questions could be coded in some ways. And it's been actually a really good process in that we haven't found much coding like in questions of like, does this previous iterations may have things like laziness and apathy, and we know that those have often been used, coded language in particular for folks of color, to say that they're not doing work when they really are. And so again, really things to think through in this process. And then the other thing, as I mentioned earlier, is are you able to connect with folks who share identities and ask them what their experiences have been at the institution, with your supervisor, and with the office? I think it was always really powerful when no one on the committee was present in a room and I had time with people. I think it was really powerful when I could talk specifically with students, talk with and say, so what's going on? What are the perceptions? What are the realities that are on the ground here for folks as we think through these things? And so again, how are you able to use, as we talked about earlier, multiple sources of information to think through how your office, your supervisor, your institution is perceived, and how will you fit or make fit happen in that space if you choose to enter it. So this is the end of my formal presentation. And I really am excited for questions and ways to potentially think through some more pieces. But I wanted to give us some digestible bites first to go into that.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. We appreciate it. Alex, have you gotten any questions thus far?
I haven't seen any yet.
Okay. Well, Well, while we wait and see if there's any from Javanto, who's on the back end, who's running all this for us, I want to give a shout out to him, who's been instrumental in helping us coordinate this process. And we'll see if there are any questions. Thank you so much for your time. Alice, you gave me quite a bit to think about, as I have been a part of the job search process many times, and appreciated thinking about, particularly if the supervisor that you have doesn't hold those same identities, right? And how do you make space for that?
Right.
And do you make the choice? How do you ask those questions to figure out whether or not that place is going to be comfortable for you, right? And is that person in that place to have some of those conversations, or do you go elsewhere to find sort of that holistic support, and how that can be really challenging for folks, regardless of area or functional area, to navigate.
Yeah, and I think too, there's just persistent realities that people have to experience. And while I would love folks to have their ideal jobs and in ways that the anchors work, I also understand that like there are folks who have been searching not just in our traditional thoughts of 3 to 6 months, but who have been searching for a year or two because of the ways in which systems affect the job search process in our lives, and that's really challenging. And so I don't want to like ever sugarcoat that part of the process at all.
Yeah, I know. I would agree. Job searching, is so exciting. There's such possibility and hope, right? But it's daunting. It's demanding, and I think it's really demoralizing sometimes. And again, not to sugarcoat it, right? It can take a lot out of you,
right?
And especially if you have the opportunity to go onto multiple campuses, and it can just be really, really tough, especially if you get lots of opportunity, and then nothing materializes, or you don't find that place where you want to be, or you see potential for your ability to flourish. And I think that's incredibly hard. Yeah.
And sometimes too, I think another piece of, not necessarily advice, but a way of thinking too, is that some folks, for instance, get into a job and they made the best decision with all the information they had, and they were like, whoa, this is not, this ain't it, y'all. This ain't it, right?
I was sold a bag of goods, right? Or what did I miss, and you can be prepped forever, and then sometimes institutions put on a really great show, and you have to be able to sort of sift through that. Maybe it looks like we do have a question. Alex, are you able to access that? If not, I can read it for you.
Do you want to read it? That way everyone can hear the question, and then I will respond.
So Daniel says, fantastic presentation. Thank you for sharing. We're hearing from Michael Harris. In terms of salary, when in the process is it a good time to negotiate or ask? Many have told me that it should be asked after the offer, but is it appropriate to ask prior to that time?
Yeah, I think for me, the general leaning is asking maybe what the salary range is after a phone interview, or maybe in a follow-up to a phone interview, because I've had friends who've actually had throughout the process have not gotten the salary number, and they figured out at the end, they were like, I could never have worked for this. And this just wasn't going to work for what I needed. And so I think coming at it that frame, either in a phone interview or maybe an email, you want to wait to negotiate the salary later, and it's up to you to decide if you want to continue the process once you hear that number. Because in some ways, some folks hide the number because they're like, we don't have much to offer, and that's just their reality, right? So that's, I would say, the phone interview, or maybe some follow-up correspondence once you get a phone interview, but that would be the first place to maybe think about that.
Absolutely. And then we have one from Daniel. How does your identity come across in your resume and cover letter? You talked a lot about the painfulness of the cover letters, and I was nodding vigorously. Recognizing that there's an expectation of a certain look, but that may not meet your style.
Yeah, I think, one of the things a lot of people ask me about is, for instance, like, putting pronouns in cover letters and resumes, or indicating identities in some way or signaling them in some ways in your resume or cover letter. That's a decision up to you. Some things to think about as you make that decision. One, in some ways, folks don't have necessarily those options, right? So some folks, I imagine, have seen the studies that have talked about folks with Latinx sounding names or Black or African American sounding names often get hired less or interviewed less, and people can't control that, right? That's their name. But to what does that mean? Does that signal that you want to be at that place? One, but on the flip side too, it's really quite frankly fucked up that people do that. Cursing was just going to happen eventually. So one, thinking through that, but also thinking through the ways in which, if those identities are important to you, signaling that in your cover letter, right? And so it was really important for me as someone who is white to really talk about the role of anti-racism in my practice when applying to this LGBT resource center. That was really critically important for me. And if folks didn't want to do anti-racist work when I got here, it was going to happen when I got here. And thankfully, I work in an office that very much espouses that as actually a core tenet of our practice. And so thinking about the ways in which that information will be received, but if you want to share ways to signal that identities, I'd love to welcome that conversation over email, maybe like sorting through some of that as well, because I think it would differ based on identity and context as well.
Absolutely. So it looks as though there's a shout out and not a question, but for the NASPA Tweets Conference Session Party of One, Navigating the Workspace with Your Identity from Emily. So I just wanted to put that out there for folks. And then we're getting some snaps from Daniel, which is really, really exciting. So great. Thanks, Daniel. If folks have other questions, this would be the time to go ahead and ask them, and we'll certainly take a moment to see if there are any last final questions. But it looks as though, Alex, you have welcomed the opportunity for folks to potentially connect with you via email or reach out in another method if there's an offline conversation that could be useful for people. So with that, we have Alex's contact information.
Yep. And so you can follow me on Twitter at it's AlexCL. My email is also on the screen, alexclang@gmail.com. You can see a running theme through all of my contact information, as well as my website, it's alexcl.com as well. Love to connect with folks, love to talk and chat some things out. I know I am more and more having thoughts about job search processes and finding new community and new fit, which can be a really daunting and scary process. I know for me, as someone who I'm lucky enough that my insurance covers going to see a counselor, and I'm potentially getting ready for a new shift and thinking about finding a new counselor. That is also terrifying in many ways, as well as leaving community behind that I've developed here. And so it's been really important to think through some of these pieces in community with other folks who have similarly gone through it or going through it. So really welcome the opportunity to connect.
Thank you so much, Alex. We really appreciate it. And with that, if there aren't any other questions or any final comments from Alex, I'll close us out. Alex, is there anything else that you want to share with us today?
I think only thing I would share is that whatever thoughts that you're potentially having about the job search process, I imagine you are not the first person, and that doesn't make it any less scary. And so the other thing I will say that I really didn't talk about in the presentation, but I talk about with graduate students all the time, is leverage your network. Leverage your connections to the best of your abilities. If people are here for you and they're in your network, they're not going to mind that you send them all 20 places you're thinking of applying. We have grads who are in our first year SAA program right now, or our first years in the SAA program rather, who are applying for internships. And one of them is applying for somewhere I've previously worked, and I'm really excited to get them connected with someone there to talk with them a little bit more. So the ways in which you can also use your network and connections is really crucial and critical in this process as well.
Thank you, Alex. So with that, I want to say thank you to our backend folks, Gervanto Van Humert, and then folks within the NPGS and Gender and Sexuality Region 4 East leadership team who have collaborated with this webinar and brought Alex to us and all of their expertise. And so the YouTube link will be posted on the Facebook page. So if folks were not able to join us, I know there are some of you out there that want to access this expertise, please feel free. That link will be posted and you can watch that at your leisure. It'll also be on the NPGS and Gender and Sexuality Region 4 East Facebook pages. So multiple ways to access the webinar. And I want to close us out and say I hope that you found this information to be valuable. I certainly did. Incredible reminders and references for me and hopefully for folks that are watching as well. So thank you again, Alex, for your time. And I hope everyone has a good afternoon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.